you may or may not be aware, there was a warehouse, if you will, in Oakland, California. Oakland is right across the bay from San Francisco. And this warehouse was purchased and occupied by a group of individuals that made it their home and sort of loaded the interior up with artifacts and things like that. It was called, I believe, the Ghost Ship. They loaded it up with so much, let's say, interior, what they thought was artwork, and you know, let's say their art, you know, whether it be wood things. It was, a lot of it was combustible. They were living in the space. There was a lot of people that would congregate in the space as you know, a meeting place. And when it caught fire, people were trapped, and there was a lot of fatalities. And the Oakland Fire Department had no idea. They hadn't inspected the building. They weren't aware of the potential fire problem, if you will, and life hazard. So, I mean, and it's a case that that department was so busy and understaffed that they couldn't possibly get around to all the buildings in the areas that they protect. And this is an issue for many departments around the world.
We experienced a smoke explosion here in the city of Virginia, where it happened to actually have caught it on camera. And it was featured in a Firehouse magazine, and it was extensively talked about on podcasts, and I've even presented on this incident. So we were called to a multi-tenant structure. There was actually, it was a subdivided house into 9 separate rooms. There was 8 tenants, but when we pulled up, we had no idea how many tenants were there, how many were out of the building. The manager couldn't locate those people. So one of the first things that would have been helpful is to know everybody was out of the structure. I had no technology to do that. I had no sensory capabilities. I had nothing other than an actual search of the structure, which took quite some time given where the fire was and due to some hoarding issues. Even the layout of the building, which had been changed several times due to reconstruction and modifications, there was no map. I had no layout of that structure. So even finding out where the fire was interesting, and finding the access point. The temperatures inside of that building would have been really nice to know, because it continued to build up to the point where we did have that smoke explosion. Fortunately, the smoke telegraphed that to us. We saw the yellowish, dark colored smoke. It's building, the volume, the velocity, the density, and the color all just basically screamed, some conditions are changing. It's getting worse. All crews were pulled out of the building. And then we had the smoke explosion. So there was no one in the building. Another technology aspect beside the temperature sensors would have been to know which resources were coming. There was, I believe, 10 different departments paged to this fire, and they were paged multiple times. Some responded with 1 person or 2, and some responded with 4. And so knowing what we had for resources coming, again, it's a highly high paid on call or volunteer system around here, and only, you know, 1 other career department was really at this scene. So had I been able to know the locations of the people in the building, the layout of the building, the temperatures inside, that would have prompted me to pull a crew out even sooner and given an extra margin of safety. As it was barely 30 seconds from the time the crew exited, and that's way too close for comfort. And then also knowing what resources were coming, so you can get a game plan together and play to your strengths instead of just waiting for see who shows up. So that's how I can think of how technology would have helped me with an incident.
One call comes to mind. We were looking for a patient that was had a medical condition where they needed assistance right away, and they were unable to communicate on their own, but their family knew that they needed help. And we were looking for some period of time on a large rural property, and they would describe it's behind the red barn. And I'd scan the horizon, I'm like, I see 5 red barns, and it's down Mr. So-and-so's road. Well, I don't know. I didn't grow up. I don't know Mr. So-and-so's road. And well, if you look to the west, really? And literally that was the sort of communication. And finally we found the structure that the person was in. We took care of them, and the call went well. But simply knowing where someone was make a big difference for us, and all the way up to big calls like the Oakland Hills fire, where 25 souls were lost, and 3 homes I helped build in my mom's home, and 3,500 structures in total were lost. Think of how the capabilities that might come into play on something like that, where pretty quickly the dispatch system and the old school way of doing things become impacted. Yeah.
There was a call about 5-6 years ago that we had, and we have the Colorado River comes through our fire service area. So we've had times where you've had people who have capsized, they've gotten out of their canoe, their raft, and so they're going down the river, and there's a lot of white water rapids to it. And so there was one time when we did lose somebody off their boat, off their canoe, if I recall right. And it just takes so long to get everybody to come and do this long stretch of the Colorado River to be, we have a plan that so-and-so will be, someone will be at, bridge A, someone will be at bridge B, someone will be at bridge C, looking for this person, or, as a recovery, looking for the body. That, we wish we had some things where you could clear a spot once you do that initial search. Like if we knew from each other and didn't do as much radio conversation that, shore C was cleared and shore A still needs to be looked at. You do a lot of pre-planning for calls like that, but it would be nice to have some kind of technology, even if you don't have to do radio, because we've gotten to the point where we all love to text each other. I mean, we like talking to each other, but texting is better, because you can see it when you need to see it. You don't have to be interrupted by something else. And I think we're just so used to that now that when you go back to, like you say, old school, just radio and radio traffic and trying to keep the information to the incident commander about what's being cleared or not. It would be really nice if we had that piece, to be able to do some just definite ways to get through that initial search, because we ended up calling a helicopter for it. And unfortunately it was a body recovery, and we didn't find them till way down the river at the end of the day.
So one incident in particular, this occurred a number of years in the past, was a large, very large, complex plastics manufacturing facility in which a fire originated actually just because of a series of events that resulted in a very small scale fire that quickly grew in both severity and magnitude in a very, very short time frame. That resulted in a very, very large scale and very complex multiple alarm fire in which the fire departments, the brigades that responded, really had some significant challenges. But primarily due to the complexity and of the footprint in terms of the square meters and square footage of that building, coupled with the volume, the interconnected buildings, along with the complexities of the operations, both in terms of protective systems, the construction of the building, the occupancy at the time. This was a very early evening fire that occurred. The challenges were to be able to coordinate the location of severity of that incident, coupled with what kind of building features were there to help us relative to controlling or mitigating or just keeping out of harm's way the fire brigade, fire service personnel, as well as the civilians, those that were working in that particular building. So the building intelligence, having accurate building intel would have been very, very advantageous to all of us, both at the command and operational level of managing that incident and all the way to the field units that were operating, trying to keep out of harm's way or to deploy the appropriate level of resources to be able to mitigate and keep that fire from fully extending to that structure. This was actually it was the fourth largest industrial fire here in the United States at that time. And I actually was operating in that scene in a couple of different capacities. But again, because of that time and place, the lack of up-to-date building information was lacking, and there was certainly the potential for a lot of bad things to occur to our personnel relative to injury or fatalities based upon the continuing very rapid escalation of that incident in terms of its severity and growth. So, going back to our common statement here earlier, one of the biggest advantages that any organization may have, especially when dealing with fire department responses, dealing with structural fires, is just knowledge of how that building was built, information on the building's protective systems that might help us from a life safety and an operational standpoint. And then at the same time, building information that will help us to figure out what the appropriate plans may be from a strategy and tactics, and then a management and a mitigation standpoint. So it was certainly challenging at best. Aerial devices, helicopters were put in place to try to identify some opportunities, but even with a very large-scale fire that was burning through the building, the veil of darkness was a challenge, and especially at high elevations. Again, you're just trying to utilize all of the availability of resources and technology that was available at the time, but that continues to be part of those challenges, just having that kind of information. And certainly, although no one lost their lives at that particular event, the likelihood was very, very high risk potential involvement for all personnel.